What would you do if the person you loved the most simply walked away one day, without a word? Not in anger, not in a storm of conflict, just vanished. Left you with a child, a silence, and a house full of unfinished promises. Elliot Harper was a self-made millionaire, powerful, admired, unstoppable, until the day he made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He left behind his wife Margaret and their young son Caleb, chasing a dream dressed as freedom, only to discover that success without love is just another kind of loneliness. But here's the real question: if you lost everything you once had, and found the ones you abandoned, living a life without you stronger, happier, would you still try to return? Would you ask to be forgiven? Would you even be welcome? This is not just a story of regret. It's a story about the human capacity for change, the quiet resilience of those left behind, and the question we all carry: can love survive silence? Join us on this deeply moving journey. If this story touches something in you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. Millionaire abandons his loved one and his son. Years later, he sees her in a hotel with a man. The rain had stopped just before midnight. A soft mist curled over the rolling hills of Vermont, blanketing the fields like a faded memory. Inside the small farmhouse, the only light came from the kitchen, where Margaret Harper sat quietly, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that still held the warmth of the tea she'd forgotten to drink. She hadn't spoken a word in over an hour. Upstairs, Caleb was sound asleep, 6 years old, clutching the stuffed bear his father had given him on his 5th birthday. The house was still. So still it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath, and miles away, in a penthouse apartment overlooking Boston Harbor, Elliot Harper zipped up his suitcase. He didn't look at the photographs on the wall. He didn't check his phone. He didn't even bother to leave a note. Instead, he moved through the room like a ghost, methodical, detached. The decision had been made weeks ago, though the silence between him and Margaret had started long before that. The truth, he hadn't known how to be still. Not really. Not since the business began to soar. And with it, his hunger for something bigger, more extravagant, more thrilling. Margaret had been his grounding force once, all warm hands and clay-covered aprons, her eyes soft, behind glasses, smudged from hours at the pottery wheel. But life on the farm had worn her down. The woman who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen now wore tired eyes and silence like a second skin. He told himself it wasn't personal. Claire had appeared at a conference in Chicago poised, elegant, and unapologetically ambitious. She laughed without restraint, challenged his ideas, leaned in with intensity every time he spoke. She didn't smell like wood smoke or earth. She wore perfume. She quoted poets and investment figures in the same breath. She was everything his life on the farm was not. That was the beginning of the unraveling, the long, slow retreat from responsibility, from family dinners, from Saturday mornings with Caleb in the barn. Each time Margaret called, he let it ring. Each weekend he was too busy to come home, until he simply stopped returning. Now, as he stepped into the elevator with his suitcase in hand, the city lights flickered against the mirrored walls. His reflection stared back, tailored suit, clean-shaven jaw, hollow eyes. He told himself this was freedom, but a strange tightness curled in his chest. He remembered Margaret's hands, the way they moved like music when shaping clay. He remembered the way Caleb once ran down the driveway barefoot, waving wildly as Elliot's car pulled away. And just for a moment, his fingers trembled, but Claire was waiting downstairs, her car already idling, her driver tapping the wheel with impatience. "Ready?" she asked. When he slid into the back seat beside her, Elliot nodded. Yes. He didn't look back. Not once. The days after Elliot left weren't filled with shouting or broken dishes. There were no slamming doors or dramatic confrontations, just silence, and the slow, aching realization that he was truly gone. Margaret Harper didn't cry that first morning. She woke early, like always, before the sun had crested the hills. She fed the chickens, checked the weathered fence line, and swept the kitchen floor the same way she had every day for years. Her body moved through the motions, but her mind was somewhere else. It kept replaying the last time Elliot had been home. The way he avoided her eyes, the two quick goodbyes, the lingering smell of cologne on his jacket, one she didn't recognize. The phone calls had already grown fewer. The excuses had grown vaguer. And then, nothing. No message. No explanation. Just silence. Margaret stood by the old oak tree that afternoon, her hands stained with soil. She had been planting marigolds near the porch, something to keep her occupied. But when she paused and looked out over the quiet fields, her chest tightened with something unfamiliar. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sadness. Not quite. It was a hollow kind of disbelief, like being left behind by a train you didn't know had departed. Inside, Caleb played quietly in the living room, lining up toy cars across the rug. His favorite was a small blue pickup, the one he always said looked like Daddy's truck. He called out without looking up. "Mom." When is Dad coming back? Margaret froze. The question was innocent. Too innocent. She stepped inside, wiping her hands on a dish towel that was already stained from the day's work. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said gently, kneeling beside him. "But we're going to be okay." Caleb looked at her for a moment, his bright eyes searching her face. Then he nodded, returning to his cars. To him, okay was enough. For now. But for Margaret, that small exchange felt like being torn open. That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, she stood by the window, a glass of wine untouched in her hand. The farmhouse creaked with age and wind. It had always been quiet, Vermont quiet, but now it was different. Now, the silence carried weight. It echoed with questions she wasn't ready to ask aloud. Had she missed the signs? Had she let Elliot drift too far away? Or had he simply chosen a life without her and their son? She reached for the old record player tucked away beneath the bookshelves. It hadn't been used in months. She chose an album by James Taylor, something soft, something familiar, and let the music fill the corners of the room. Margaret closed her eyes. There was no space for anger, not yet, only the numbness of absence, and the quiet, steady resolve of a woman who would find a way forward, if not for herself, then for her boy. Because someone had to. The skyline of Manhattan stretched like a promise across the evening sky. Elliot Harper leaned against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Claire's high-rise condo. Below, the lights of the city blinked like stars trapped in concrete. He used to find this view intoxicating, the evidence of progress, ambition, dominance. Now, it mostly made him feel small. Behind him. Claire laughed. The sound was rich and effortless, rising above the clinking of glasses and the hum of jazz floating from hidden speakers. She was surrounded by people, venture capitalists, tech founders, artists who wore their confidence like armor. Everyone in the room seemed to know where they were going, except Elliot. He took another sip of bourbon, the ice rattling against the sides of the glass. It burned going down just enough to make him feel something. Claire moved through the crowd like she was born for it. Her dress shimmered under the recessed lights, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. When she reached Elliot, she leaned in, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "You look like you're somewhere else tonight." He forced a smile. Just tired. That wasn't the truth, of course. But Claire wasn't one for long explanations. She preferred things light, effortless, curated, in her world. Everything had a place: success, pleasure, even pain, if it could be spun into something beautiful. They had met 8 months earlier in Chicago, and from the start, she was like a whirlwind, ambitious, magnetic, unapologetically bold. She challenged Elliot in ways Margaret never had. With Claire, there were no early mornings fixing fences, no slow dinners, no conversations about Caleb's favorite bedtime books. There was only movement, deals, flights, events, champagne. It was what Elliot had wanted, or so he thought. Yet now, standing in a room full of people he barely knew, with a woman who seemed to shine brighter than he ever could, Elliot felt like a supporting actor in someone else's story. Claire slipped her arm through his. "Come on," she said with a grin. "The senator just arrived. Let's make nice." He nodded, letting her lead him across the room. He said the right things, smiled at the right moments, even laughed once or twice. But beneath the surface, a different conversation was happening, one he couldn't voice. Where was Caleb right now? Had Margaret remembered to lock the chicken coop before dark? Had she told Caleb the truth? He hadn't called, not once. He told himself it was better that way, cleaner, simpler. But in truth, he didn't know what to say or whether he deserved to say anything at all. That night, long after the last guest had gone and the cleaning crew moved quietly through the condo, Claire poured herself a final glass of wine and sat by the piano, her bare feet tucked under her. "Is this what you imagined?" she asked softly, not looking at him. Elliot was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure what I imagined anymore," he replied. Claire gave a small smile, sipped her wine, and said nothing more. In the silence, Elliot heard something deeper than jazz and city sounds. He heard the quiet truth he'd been running from. The farther he got from the life he'd abandoned, the less he recognized the man in the mirror, and somewhere, deep inside, he began to wonder if the cost of this freedom was far greater than he had understood. It began with a phone call, nothing dramatic, no alarms. Just a polite voice from the firm's legal department asking Elliot to come in for a conversation. By the end of that conversation, his world had already begun to crack. The fund he helped manage, the one that had made him and Claire minor celebrities in certain New York circles, had been exposed in a series of risky, poorly disclosed investments. A journalist had caught wind, lawsuits were circling, and just like that, Elliot's reputation began to slip through his fingers like sand. Claire didn't say much when he told her. She just nodded, set down her wine glass, and picked up her phone. "I'm going to Aspen for the weekend," she said the next morning, already halfway packed. "It'll blow over." But it didn't, within weeks. Elliot found himself fielding calls from former colleagues who now treated him like a liability. Clients were pulling out, contracts disappeared, investors demanded answers, and Claire grew more distant with every passing day. Eventually, she stopped coming home. No argument, no final word, just gone. He returned to their condo one night to find her closet empty, the scent of her perfume still clinging to the curtains. A single note left on the kitchen counter read, "This life isn't for me anymore." Elliot stared at it for a long time, but no emotion came. It wasn't until days later, sitting alone in the sterile lobby of a law firm, waiting to sign over rights to his final business asset, that something in him shifted. Not anger, not fear, but emptiness. And into that emptiness, like a slow-moving fog, came the image of Margaret. He hadn't thought of her in weeks, maybe months, but now her face returned, unbidden. Not the tired version she had become in his final months on the farm, but the version she used to be, laughing at nothing on the back porch, singing softly to Caleb as she rocked him to sleep, pulling bread from the oven with flour still on her cheek. And Caleb, God, he hadn't even remembered Caleb's birthday this year. What kind of father forgets that? Elliot stood up abruptly from the waiting room and walked outside. The cold wind hit him like a confession. He had no one left, not in this city, not in any city. He wandered for hours that night, through streets that once felt like home, past buildings with his name still carved into plaques, restaurants where he used to be ushered past velvet ropes with smiles and champagne. Now no one noticed him. He was just another man in a coat, too wrinkled and eyes too tired. That weekend, he applied for a job at a mid-tier hotel near Midtown. He didn't mention his previous titles. He didn't wear a suit. He just said, "I can clean. I can work hard." The manager glanced at his resume, then at his face, and said, "We'll call you." He never did. By Monday, Elliot had sold the last of Claire's jewelry to make rent. By Wednesday, he was eating canned soup by candlelight. By Friday, he stopped pretending that this was just temporary. In the quiet, there was no more pretending. He had traded a family for a dream, and now he had neither. And for the first time, Elliot Harper felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Regret. The winter came early that year. Frost lined the edges of the windows by mid-October, and the fields around the Harper farmhouse wore a thin white coat by dawn. Inside, the wood stove crackled softly, filling the small home with warmth and the faint scent of hickory smoke. Margaret Harper stood at the kitchen sink, staring out across the pasture where the last of the leaves clung stubbornly to the maple trees. Her hands were raw from work, her shoulders aching from splitting firewood the day before. Still, she didn't complain. There was no one to hear it, and no time for it anyway. Caleb, now 7, sat at the kitchen table scribbling in a math workbook. He hummed to himself, tongue poking out in concentration. Margaret smiled faintly at the sound. He had grown so much in the last year, taller, more independent, but still carried that same quiet sweetness. It had been over a year since Elliot had vanished from their lives. No calls, no letters, no trace. The silence had grown thick, but not unbearable, not anymore. It was strange how the body adapts, how the heart reshapes itself around emptiness when it must. Still, some days were harder than others. Margaret reached into a high cabinet, searching for the old baking sheets she rarely used. Thanksgiving was coming, and she had promised Caleb they'd make pumpkin pie from scratch. As she reached, her hand brushed a box pushed to the back, small, dusty, forgotten. She hesitated. Inside were the tools she hadn't touched in years. Her old pottery tools, wooden ribs, shaping wires, brushes still stiff with dry clay. Her breath caught in her throat. She had almost forgotten this version of herself, the woman who once molded beauty from earth, who filled gallery rooms with color and texture, who lost hours to creation. Before the farm, before motherhood, before Elliot. Later that evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, she carried the box out to the small shed behind the house. The wheel was still there, under a tarp, surrounded by cobwebs. She cleared the space without thinking, sweeping, dusting, dragging in a heater from the garage. She didn't plan to do anything, not really. But her hands knew otherwise. They moved with quiet memory, soaking the clay, kneading it gently, placing it on the center of the wheel. She sat down, took a breath, and pressed her palms together. The wheel spun. So did her thoughts, of who she had been, of who she had become, and who, perhaps, she still was. The clay yielded to her fingers, soft and wet and alive. It rose into shape, uneven at first, uncertain, like the first breath after grief, but then steadier, more defined. Margaret didn't smile, not quite, but something inside her shifted. Not joy, not yet, but presence. And that was something. From the window of his bedroom, Caleb watched the faint light from the shed flicker against the snow. He pulled the covers to his chin and whispered to himself, "Mom's out there making something." Yes, she was. The wind howled outside as December settled its weight across the valley. Snow had begun to fall steadily, quiet, constant, like the ticking of a distant clock. Margaret stood at the barn door, trying to lift a sack of grain that had clearly doubled in weight since the summer. Her boots slipped slightly on the icy ground, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Need a hand." The voice came from behind her, low, steady, unfamiliar. She turned quickly, startled, tightening her grip on the bag. A tall man in his late 40s stood by the fence, hat pulled low over sun-touched hair, hands in the pockets of a worn canvas coat. His eyes were kind, but didn't pry. "Name's Henry Lawson," he said, giving a polite nod. "Live about 2 miles up the ridge. Heard from town you might be needing help with the winter prep." Margaret hesitated. She wasn't one to accept charity, and definitely not from strangers. The memory of Elliot's departure still lingered in the corners of her mind like smoke that wouldn't clear. But something in Henry's demeanor gave her pause. He wasn't pushing, just offering. "I've got it, thanks," she replied, hoisting the bag with more pride than strength. Henry didn't argue. He simply stepped forward, took the other side of the sack without a word, and they carried it together into the barn. That was how it began. Over the next few days, Henry returned, never uninvited, never overbearing. He patched a leaking pipe in the greenhouse, repaired a broken hinge on the chicken coop, brought over firewood without saying where it came from. When Margaret protested, he'd just shrug and say, "You'd do the same," and maybe she would have, a year ago. 2. Now, she wasn't so sure who she was anymore, but Caleb liked him. That mattered. The boy followed Henry around the farm like a shadow, asking questions about tools, tractors, and which kind of nail was best for fixing fence rails. Henry answered them all with patience, sometimes letting Caleb hold the hammer just to feel useful. One afternoon, Margaret found the two of them laughing by the porch as they tried and failed to fix an old wind chime that had lost its tone. It was the first time in months she'd heard Caleb laugh that hard. That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Margaret stood by the sink while Henry finished stacking wood outside. Snow had gathered on his shoulders, but he didn't seem to mind. There was something different about him, not just the way he moved, but the way he stayed. So many people in her life had left. Henry didn't ask questions about Elliot. He didn't ask about the pottery in the shed, or why she sometimes stopped talking mid-sentence and stared out the window like she was waiting for something that would never come. He simply showed up and stayed. When he finally came inside that night, shaking the snow from his coat, she handed him a cup of coffee and said quietly, "Thank you for everything." Henry met her eyes, then looked down at the mug in his hand. "You don't owe me anything, Margaret. We all need a little help now and then. Some of us just don't know how to ask." She didn't respond, but her eyes softened. And in that moment, the quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was something else, something like peace. By early spring, the snow began to surrender. The last patches of white melted into the earth, revealing soil cracked from the freeze. The trees, bare and brittle just weeks before, stretched toward the softening sky. And inside, the old shed behind the Harper farmhouse, something else was blooming. Margaret sat at the pottery wheel, her hands moving with purpose. The rhythm had returned. Each morning after Caleb left for school, she made her way out back, tied her apron, and turned on the wheel. It was quiet work, solitary, but there was comfort in that. The clay didn't judge her. It didn't ask why she stopped for years, or why she sometimes froze mid-shape, overcome by memories. It just waited. She began firing small pieces in the old kiln, brushing off dust from shelves she hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Mugs, vases, bowls with uneven lips and warm glazes that reminded her of rain-soaked leaves and pine needles after storm. Henry dropped by sometimes, careful never to intrude. Just a wave through the shed window, or a gentle knock with a thermos of tea. "You've got something special here," he said one afternoon, watching her lay out finished pieces across a worn table. "You ever think about selling them?" Margaret shrugged. "I used to, a long time ago, back before things changed." Henry didn't push. He just smiled and replied, "Maybe things are changing again." She looked at her work, modest, imperfect, but hers. Maybe they were. At the farmer's market in town, she rented a small booth, just a few shelves, a folding table, and a handwritten sign, M. Harper, handmade pottery. She didn't expect much, maybe a few polite glances, a neighbor's support. But by noon, people had begun to gather. An older woman bought a mug and returned 20 minutes later to buy 3 more. A young couple asked if she took commissions. Someone from the local paper snapped a photo, said they wanted to write a piece on the return of real craftsmanship. Margaret laughed, genuinely for the first time in ages. That night, after dinner, Caleb helped her unwrap the unsold pieces and place them gently back onto the studio shelves. "You made all this, Mom?" he asked, holding up a little blue bowl. She nodded. "With these hands." "They're really good," he said. "Like, really, really." She smiled, wiping clay from his cheek with the side of her thumb. "Thanks, sweetheart. That means more than you know." The next day, Margaret received a call from a local gallery. Someone had seen her work at the market and wanted to feature it in a community exhibit. She nearly said no out of habit. But this time, she didn't. This time, she said yes. Because something was shifting inside her. It wasn't about proving anything, not to Elliot. not to the town, not even to herself. It was about coming home, not just to the farm, not to the routine, but to the woman she had once been, the woman she still was. The lobby of the Parkstone Hotel shimmered with quiet opulence. Marble floors gleamed under polished brass chandeliers. The air smelled of citrus and linen, with soft classical music drifting from hidden speakers. Elliot Harper mopped the floors in slow, practiced motions, his back aching in places he didn't talk about. It wasn't a bad job. It wasn't glamorous either, but it was work, honest work. And lately, that was all he had left. His name badge read Ed Harper, a small attempt to distance himself from the man he used to be, the one whose name had once graced boardroom doors and charity galas, the one who had vanished the moment the foundation cracked. That morning had started like any other. He had clocked in at 6, cleaned 2 bathrooms, stocked the linen closets on floor 7. By noon, he was finishing his pass through the lobby when the elevator chimed. He didn't look up at first, just kept mopping. Just another family. He figured tourists, or maybe someone in town for the art fair. But then he heard a voice, a soft laugh, a familiar one. His head snapped up and the world tilted. There she was, Margaret, standing at the reception desk in a navy blue coat, her hair longer than he remembered, loosely curled around her shoulders. She was smiling, calm, engaged in conversation with the clerk. At her side stood a man tall, quiet, with kind eyes, and next to him, Caleb. No longer a boy, taller now, maybe 12 or 13. His posture relaxed, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets, his eyes scanning the room with casual curiosity. Elliot froze. The mop slipped from his hand, clattering to the marble with a sharp, echoing clang. Heads turned, Margaret's included. Their eyes met. For a moment, a brief, impossibly long moment, time stopped. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just looked at him. And in her eyes, he didn't see hatred, or anger, or even pain. He saw something far more final, indifference, a quiet recognition of someone she had long since let go. Then she turned back to the clerk, finishing the check-in with effortless grace, as though the man with the mop was no more than another piece of polished floor. Elliot stood there, stunned, rooted to the spot. Caleb hadn't even noticed him. Or maybe he didn't recognize him at all. And somehow, that hurt more. They walked away, the 3 of them, toward the elevator. Caleb glanced up at the man beside Margaret and said something that made them both laugh. The doors closed behind them, silent and smooth. Elliot remained where he was, the mop handle pressed into his palm. His chest burned. Later, he sat in the janitor's supply room, the door locked, the light dim. His hands trembled as he poured cold coffee into a paper cup. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it wouldn't go down. She had looked free. She had looked happy. And he was invisible now, a ghost in a uniform. The family he'd abandoned had rebuilt without him, and they were thriving. No amount of bourbon or boardroom prestige could have prepared him for that moment, the quiet, devastating clarity of what he had truly lost. He didn't cry, not then, but something inside him folded in on itself, and for the first time, Elliot Harper understood the full weight of his regret, not just as a man who made mistakes, but as a man who had vanished when he was needed most. That night, Elliot didn't go home. He walked the streets of Manhattan long after his shift had ended, his uniform bundled under his arm, his thoughts louder than the city noise. Neon lights bled into puddles. Taxis roared past, but he moved through it all like a man underwater, slow, heavy, disconnected. Everywhere he looked, he saw reflections, not of himself, but of who he used to be. Men in tailored suits passing by, laughing into phones. Families spilling out of restaurants, hand in hand. A boy Caleb's age kicking a soccer ball on the sidewalk while his father chased after him, laughing, alive. And Elliot, he had run away from all of it. At a small, greasy diner near 8th Avenue, he slid into a booth and ordered a coffee he wouldn't drink. His hands were numb, his thoughts louder than ever. Margaret hadn't said a word, but she hadn't needed to. Her silence was more powerful than any accusation. And Caleb, he hadn't even blinked. Did he know? Did he remember? Did he ever ask about the man who used to read him bedtime stories and toss him on his shoulders during apple-picking season? Or had he already replaced those memories with the steady, gentle presence of Henry a stranger? A better man. Elliot pulled a pen from his coat and reached for the back of a napkin. His handwriting had grown messier over the years, but the words poured out fast, unfiltered, shaky. Maggie, I don't expect this to make up for anything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this. Maybe because if I don't put these words somewhere, they'll bury me from the inside out. He paused. The rest wouldn't come. Not yet. He folded the napkin, placed it in his coat pocket, and stared out the window. A couple walked past her head, resting on his shoulder, his hand on her back in a gesture so natural it almost hurt to witness. Elliot looked away. By the time he returned to his one-room apartment, the sky had begun to lighten. He didn't sleep, just sat at the edge of the bed, still dressed, hands clasped between his knees. All this time, he had told himself a story, that Margaret was better off without him, that he would only weigh her down, that Caleb was too young to remember, but seeing them again had shattered that lie. They had remembered. They had just moved on. And now, he was the ghost, the man who left. The one who disappeared into the noise, the one whose name no longer fit in their lives. He closed his eyes and saw them again, not from the past, but from yesterday. The way Margaret laughed, the way Caleb looked up at Henry, the way she didn't flinch when their eyes met. She was no longer waiting for him. And the part that hurt the most, she shouldn't be. But even ghosts crave redemption. Even those who vanished once sometimes wonder if they might be seen again. The park was quieter than usual that afternoon. Leaves rustled softly across the path as a breeze drifted through the trees, carrying the scent of warm earth and early spring. Benches stretched beneath the shade like empty pauses in conversation, waiting to be filled. Elliot Harper sat alone on the far end of one. His coat was pressed, his hair combed small gestures that felt like armor. In his hand, the letter, folded, reread too many times to count. He didn't know if Margaret would come. He had left a note with the hotel concierge, the one place he was sure she'd pass through again. He hadn't signed it with guilt or desperation. Just a simple line, "If you have time, I'd like to apologize." The bench near the pond, 3 p.m., and now. As the clock struck 3, he waited. The minutes dragged, full of wind and doubt. But then, just as he was ready to give up, she appeared. Margaret walked toward him in her quiet way. No hesitation, no performance. She wore a simple linen blouse, her hair pulled back, a calmness around her like a shield. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze unreadable. Elliot stood. "Thank you," he said softly, "for coming." She nodded once. "I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you." She sat. He followed. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that had weight. "I saw you," she finally said, eyes on the water, "at the hotel." "I know. You looked different." "I am." Another pause. He unfolded the letter, held it in his hands. "I wrote this, but I don't think it says enough. Or maybe it says too much." Margaret didn't look at the letter. Her hands rested in her lap, calm, unmoved. "I was a coward," he said. "I left without warning. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that you'd be better off without me, that Caleb wouldn't remember." She turned her face toward him then, slowly, deliberately. "But we did." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sharp. It was steady and final. Elliot swallowed hard. "I know I can't undo what I did. I don't expect forgiveness. I needed to say it, out loud, that I was wrong, that I hurt you, that I hurt him." Margaret looked away again, to the pond, where ducks drifted lazily near the reeds. "You were a chapter in my life, Elliot," she said, "one I didn't expect to end the way it did. But it did end." He nodded. I see that now. She continued, her voice softer. And I survived. Not because of you, but in spite of you. Those words landed harder than any slap. But I'm not angry anymore, she added. Almost like a gift. Anger takes too much. And I've spent years rebuilding. Myself, my son, my peace. Elliot looked at her. Truly looked. There was strength in her he had never seen before. Not the kind that comes from endurance, but from rebirth, from choosing to live again, despite everything. I never stopped thinking about you, he said. Margaret smiled, faintly sad, but not bitter. I stopped thinking about you a long time ago. A breeze passed between them. He folded the letter again, held it in his lap. What about Caleb, he asked. Not sure why. Not sure he deserved to. Margaret's voice was quiet. He's got a good life, a stable home, a man who shows up. If he ever wants to find you, he will. But it'll have to be his choice. Elliot nodded. There was nothing else to say. Margaret stood, brushing the wrinkles from her blouse. I hope you find peace, Elliot. I really do. He looked up, eyes glistening. Thank you. She walked away without looking back. This time, he didn't expect her to. And for the first time, he didn't chase what was already gone. The gallery was small, tucked between a florist and an antique bookshop, but the windows shone like beacons in the early evening light. Inside, soft yellow lamps cast a warm glow across white walls lined with pottery, handcrafted, organic, beautifully imperfect. Elliot stood outside for a long time, hands buried in his coat pockets. The invitation had been public and open event to celebrate local artists. He'd seen Margaret's name in the paper. M. Harper, featured ceramicist. He hadn't planned to come, but something had drawn him there. Not Margaret, not entirely. It was the name listed beneath hers, Caleb Harper, Youth Artist Showcase. He stepped inside quietly, hoping to blend into the crowd of locals and art lovers, his presence unnoticed. But his eyes found Caleb instantly. The boy, now tall, lanky, with a quiet confidence that took Elliot's breath, stood near a small display of painted tiles and a framed sketch of the old barn. He wore a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled, hair slightly tousled. He was talking to a woman from the gallery who clearly admired his work. Elliot stayed near the doorway. He didn't want to interrupt, didn't even know if he should. He just needed to see him. After a while, Caleb stepped away from the crowd and wandered toward the refreshment table. Elliot hesitated, then took a slow breath and moved toward him. Caleb glanced up and their eyes met. There was no dramatic pause, no gasps, just quiet recognition. I didn't think you'd come, Caleb said. His voice had deepened, not quite a man's, but no longer a child's. I almost didn't, Elliot admitted. They stood in silence for a few moments. The gallery buzzed gently around the music, laughter, conversation, but between them, the world had narrowed to something still. I saw your sketch, Elliot said. The barn. It's beautiful. Caleb nodded, his expression unreadable. It's where I feel calm. Elliot swallowed hard. I used to feel that way there too. Another pause. You look like your mom, he added, but your eyes, those are mine. Caleb blinked, not in surprise, but in measured thought. You left, he said plainly. No anger, no venom, just truth. I did. Why, Elliot sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor. I thought I was chasing something important. I told myself I was doing it for you, but the truth is, I was running from things I didn't know how to face. Caleb didn't respond right away. Then, do you regret it? Elliot looked up, meeting his son's eyes fully for the first time. Every single day. There was no tearful embrace, no sudden forgiveness. Just a boy, now a young man studying the man who had once been a ghost. I don't know what to say, Caleb murmured. You don't have to say anything. Elliot replied, I don't want anything from you. I wanted you to know that I see what I missed, and I'm sorry for all of it. Caleb looked down at his hands, then back up again. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said honestly, but I don't hate you. That alone made Elliot's knees weak. Thank you, he said, his voice breaking. That's more than I deserve. Someone called Caleb's name from across the gallery, Maggie's voice, warm and full of pride. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. I should go, he said. Elliot nodded. But as the boy turned to leave, he paused. You can come by the farm sometime, if you want. Elliot's throat tightened. I'd like that, only if it's okay. Caleb gave a single, slow nod, not a promise, but maybe a beginning. Then he walked away. And Elliot stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by light and clay and color, and something new blooming in his chest. Hope. The days grew longer as spring leaned gently into summer. On the Harper farm, wildflowers sprouted along the edge of the old fence, and the chickens clucked lazily in the midday sun. The pottery shed stood open most days now, its shelves fuller, the kiln warm, and the smell of clay mingling with lilac from the garden. Inside, Margaret shaped a wide bowl, her fingers moving with focus, not haste. Caleb sat nearby sketching, his headphones in, bobbing his head slightly to music only he could hear. From time to time, he glanced up at his mother, then back down to his pad, peaceful, normal, whole, outside. Henry repaired a loose board on the back deck, the steady rhythm of his hammer echoing against the hills. Every now and then, he'd pause to sip his coffee and look toward the horizon like a man who'd learned to love quietly. It was an ordinary afternoon, which made it extraordinary. Elliot stood at the edge of the driveway, unsure whether to move closer. He had driven 5 hours, not with certainty, just hope. A hope that didn't demand anything, that didn't expect redemption, only the chance to witness what he had once walked away from. He held a small paper bag in one hand, 2 handmade mugs he'd bought from a local market. The woman selling them said they reminded her of forgiveness. When Margaret stepped out of the shed and saw him, there was a pause. Not long, not sharp, just a breath. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. He raised the bag slightly in greeting. I thought maybe you'd have room for 2 more, he said. Margaret looked at the bag, then at him. Her eyes were calm. Older, wiser. I think we have enough, she replied. Then, softer, but leave them anyway. Elliot set the bag gently on the porch rail. I'm staying in town for a few days, he said. No pressure, just wanted you to know. Margaret nodded once. That was all. From inside the house. Caleb's laughter rose through the open window, a light, free sound that stopped Elliot in his tracks. That laughter wasn't his. It belonged to someone else now, to Henry, to the man who stayed. But strangely, that didn't shatter him. Instead, it settled something inside. Elliot turned back toward his car. He didn't ask to stay, didn't demand time. He had learned finally the quiet strength in accepting what could not be repaired. Before he left, he looked over his shoulder one last time. Margaret was gone, back in the shed, but the mugs remained on the porch rail, kissed by golden light, and maybe that was enough. Sometimes, the greatest act of love isn't reunion or forgiveness. It's the courage to face the life you broke and still choose to honor it from afar. The wind stirred gently through the trees as he drove away, and behind him, on a quiet farm, the clay continued to turn beneath steady hands. What we walk away from sometimes defines us more than what we chase. Elliot's journey reminds us that success means little when love is left behind, and that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to face the pain we caused and not turn away. But this story also speaks for the silent ones, for those who stay behind, who rebuild quietly, who rise without applause, for the Margarets and Calebs of the world, whose dignity grows not in anger, but in strength, in a world that often values wealth over worth, power over presence. We must ask, how many lives are broken because someone didn't feel enough? How many are left unheard, simply because they didn't fit a narrative of success, status, or strength? Let this be a reminder. Real love stays. Real strength forgives, but never forgets. And real stories don't always have perfect endings, but they do leave something behind. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more voices to light, voices of hope, healing, and truth. Stay with us for more stories that don't just entertain, they matter. We'll see you in the next one.